of exports.
I would like 6, please.
The red minus chips represent debt they have incurred buying imports. Ideally, each player should earn enough money from his exports to pay for his imports. If he doesn't, and he continues to go deeper into debt, his economy suffers and people are thrown out of work. It's a chain reaction. Think what would happen if you went into debt and were short of cash. Eventually, you'd cut back your spending. You'd repair your old car instead of buying a new one. You might switch to spaghetti instead of meat. And your car dealer and your butcher would obviously do less business. Those are the rules. Now let's meet some of the players.
Let me see. I'll need 20 more this time.
The American is the wealthiest player at the table.
We produced a record $2 trillion worth of goods last year and provided 90 million jobs for our workers. I'd say that's doing pretty well. Of course, we did have to import a lot of oil in the process, almost 50% of what we used last year, and it was expensive, $45 billion worth. But I think it was worth it.
How many?
And again,
the American player represents only 5% of the world's population, yet he manages to consume about 1/3 of the world's oil. The other players warned him about too much of a good thing, but up until now, he hasn't listened. The West German player has the 3rd strongest economy in the game, behind the U.S. and Japan.
Last year, our industries were hurt by recession, so we only produced about $350 billion worth of goods. Our oil consumption was about 1 billion barrels, almost all of that imported. We also want a high growth rate for our country and our people, but we know too much growth, too fast, leads to inflation, and we can't forget what happened after the First World War. The memory of people using money as wallpaper because inflation had made it worthless is still too vivid.
The Japanese player also represents a strong economy, but a vulnerable one.
Nature gave Japan very few natural resources. So we have always had to import most of our food and the raw materials we need for our industries. It is for that reason that our economy operates much like a giant factory. Raw materials come in one end, they are processed, and then manufactured products are shipped out the other. We have to export to pay for our imports.
The less developed country.
Our economy depends upon the strength of our workers who earn little money but work hard to produce the special crops we sell to the rest of the world. We are trying hard to develop our industry, but at the moment we cannot sell enough exports to pay for the oil, the food, and the other imports we need, so we have to borrow from the banks.
Finally, the player from Saudi Arabia. He sits in the game as a representative of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
For many, many years, we have been dictated to by the major oil companies, who kept the price of our oil low. That has changed. We are earning a lot more money today. And we have many projects underway to build hospitals, housing, roads, for example, which will provide better living conditions for our people. We know, however, that the oil won't last forever. And frankly, many people in my country feel we should be pumping less oil so that it lasts longer.
The Saudis weren't always so rich. In 1957, the price of crude oil was only $2.08 a barrel. In 1960, it dropped to $1.80. That drop provoked a response. Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela got together to form OPEC. The idea was to have some bargaining strength with all the oil companies. Call it a union, but a union of producers. Oil was overabundant in the 1960s, and OPEC was dormant. But in 1968, they declared their intention to control the oil business. That was only rhetoric until 1969, when Muammar al-Gaddafi seized power in Libya. The following year, he started nationalizing the oil companies, and he raised the price of Libyan oil. The word went out, you can't push OPEC around. The big shock came with the Fourth Arab-Israeli War in October 1973. 10 days after the war started, OPEC raised the price 70% to $5.12 a barrel, and then 3 days later, embargo. OPEC shipments to the United States officially stopped. OPEC power had arrived full force, and to drive the point home, OPEC raised the price from $5.12 a barrel to $11.65 a barrel. With that oil price increase, the OPEC nations touched off an economic shock felt round the world.
You must be reasonable. How do you expect us to pay those prices?
To realize what such an increase could do to the world economy?
Gentlemen, you may now pay me 4 times as much for the oil.
Worldwide inflation, already spiraling up, went through the roof. Unemployment rates soared to the highest level since the Great Depression. While the oil importing nations suffered, the OPEC nations found themselves on the receiving end of the largest redistribution of wealth in the history of the world. From the pockets of industry and individual consumers worldwide, the money flowed and OPEC coffers overflowed. In 1976, the Saudis alone were earning just over $100 million a day. Let me give you an idea of what that means. At that rate, according to one calculation, the Saudis could buy all the stocks listed on our stock exchanges in 26 years, 5 months, and 9 days, the top 30 Fortune 500 companies in 8 years, 4 months, and 9 days, all the taxable real estate in Manhattan in 6 months and 3 days, and the New York Times Corporation in 2 days, 15 hours, and 17 minutes. With that tremendous outpouring of wealth, the nature of the game changed dramatically. This is the way the table looked in 1973. The United States and Saudi Arabia had more plus than minus chips. In other words, they had a surplus. They exported more than they imported. Japan and the less developed country, on the other hand, had more minus chips. They both had deficits. Now look at the table in 1974, after the price increase. Japan's deficit is 35 times larger. The United States surplus has been cut to 1/3 of what it was. And the Saudi surplus is more than 10 times what it was, some $23 billion. That was money the Saudis just couldn't spend. The docks of Jeddah Harbor were already piled high with goods, and ships were waiting up to 6 months to unload. With the Saudis unable to buy any more goods, watch what happens.
I can offer you much steel at a low price.
We've got all we need. Thank you.
So Japan turns to Germany and sells the German player enough to buy the Saudi oil.
Can I interest you in any of our exports?
No, thank you.
Would the American player be interested?
Yes, I'll take 4.
And the oil debt becomes a multi-billion-dollar hot potato which the oil importers, in effect, pass off on each other. In case you're wondering where most of that potato is ending up these days, here's the table as it looked in 1977. All those minus chips you see in front of the U.S. player indicate a large thirst for oil and an apparent fondness for potatoes.
3, please.
By 1977, all the players had begun adjusting to the high price of oil and had therefore improved their accounts, except one. Their adjustment wasn't easy. A lot of people lost jobs, but they knew it had to be done.
Keep this in mind. The world had inflation before 1973, and it had unemployment. OPEC didn't invent those problems, but it intensified them. In a moment, we'll see what Japan did to cure its ills and how that affected us.
Gentlemen, higher oil prices are going to force your import bills up. And you're all going to be tempted to cut back on your imports to save money. Some of you may also want to increase your exports so that you can have more money to pay for the oil. And let me warn you, though, if that happens, you're only going to end up hurting each other.
That was the gist of the message the International Monetary Fund gave world leaders back in 1974.
The problem is for everyone to borrow.
At the time, everyone agreed to cooperate. But inflation and mounting oil bills eventually forced several players to act in their own self-interest.
3, please.
Of all the major industrialized countries, Japan was the hardest hit by the price rise. The bright lights of Tokyo's Ginza district were turned off to save energy. Even so, Japan's balance of payments was thrown out of whack and prices soared. For Japan, the oil crisis was a nightmare come true. A cutback of imports was the one thing it feared most. After the initial panic, the Japanese government turned its attention to the inflation problem and applied the standard cure: higher interest rates and recession. It was bitter medicine, but it worked. Consumers spent less, oil consumption was reduced, and imports were cut. While the government took care of the import problem, industry took care of the exports.
Their manufacturers have not been able to sell at home very much, and they used to sell most of their products at home. So they've been pressured just to keep going, to make profits, to keep their workers at work. Pressure to export, and the United States is an open market which has accepted quite a few of Japanese goods.
And that helped their balance of payments. We can take credit for picking up a good part of Japan's oil bill. We recovered from the recession more quickly than Japan, so American consumers were buying record numbers of Japanese goods, even though the Japanese were buying few American goods. Before 1973, this was a relatively friendly game. Now that the oil price increase has saddled everybody with a lot more debt and unemployment, the game has become a much more serious matter. The volume of world trade has dropped, and in certain markets, competition has increased. That's the big picture. The buzzword the economists use is macroeconomic. To understand how Japan's adjustment to the price increase affected us, let's look at one small corner of the picture. The steel industry, like the rest of Japanese industry, responded to slow economic recovery at home by pushing exports. The way they did it, and the way everyone else in the game did it, was by cutting prices. Critics say that the Japanese wanted to keep their workers employed, so they sold steel at a loss.
They have found that it's easier and cheaper for them to produce excess quantities of steel and dump them on the world markets at less than the cost of production. They feel...
Charles Vanek is chairman of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee.
They feel that their country, their economy, is better off doing that than it would be in cutting back on production and paying the unemployed worker the cost of his maintenance during a period of unemployment.
The steel industry...
The Japanese government denies the charges.
20 years ago,
they were assisted by the government through some financial measures and taxation concessions, etc., but not so much heavily as imagined by some foreign people. Now they are not subsidized at all.
Japanese steel mills like this one near Tokyo are among the most modern and efficient in the world. Thanks to that efficiency and low prices, the Japanese were able to export almost $11 billion worth of steel last year. $2.5 billion of that went to the United States. The steel comes in all shapes and sizes, but it looks a lot different depending on your perspective. To the American consumer, it's quality steel at a low price. To the international economist looking at the larger picture, it's an export helping Japan balance the high cost of its oil. But to an American steel worker, it's a threat to his job. At Armco Steel in Houston, Texas, foreign imports, steel and automobiles, have triggered real hostility. George Hansen is president of Armco Steel's Western Division.
We have a sign up in front of this plant, out in the front gate, that says, "Buy a foreign car and put 10 Americans out of work." I firmly believe in that sign. That's exactly what happened at this plant here. People bought foreign steel and put steel workers out of work. Sometimes we tell our workers that we can't control where they buy their cars or from whom they buy them, but if they buy a foreign automobile and park it close to that furnace you see back there, we're liable to put it in the furnace and melt it down. About a year and a half ago, this steel plant out here was running about 50% of capacity, and we had 1,400 people walking the streets without jobs. There was plenty of business in the United States, but the Japanese and the English and the Italians and the South Africans were all coming in here at cheap prices and taking our steel away from us and our jobs.
Be careful, Julie.
The Jones family of Houston, Texas, doesn't talk about the balance of payments or the effects of oil prices on the world economy. But those issues have a large impact on their lives. Mark Jones was laid off by Armco for 17 months.
And the reason they give us was that foreign steel companies had been selling their steel in the United States at a lower price than American steel companies. So I was never really conscious of it, you know, of the impact that foreign companies make on the United States economy until this time.
If Mark Jones is just beginning to understand where he fits in the larger picture, his children, of course, do not.
Daddy, let's go to McDonald's.
Kids, of course, don't understand where everything comes from. They think everything grows on trees, food, groceries, toys, and money to go skating and rodeo and places like that. And they just don't seem to understand that when they ask you for $1, you don't have it. But, of course, they depend on me. But I'm mighty glad this little girl loves me that much. So, needless to say, I've got to work.
Today, Mark Jones has his job back, at least for the moment. To get the steel flowing again and the men back on the job, Armco decided to fight fire with fire in the battle with foreign imports.
So we started what we called a foreign fighter program. And that foreign fighter program was designed specifically to fight foreign competition. In other words, what we did was we cut the price of some of our major product line. You can see it on the side here. And our union people told us that they'd produce, and they did, and we cut the price, and we got our market back.
For the near future, at least, the Japanese steel industry is going to have to find additional markets for its steel, and Japan will have to get more oil money somewhere else. The reason? Both the European Economic Community and the United States have adopted plans to restrict imports of Japanese steel.
As the high price of oil pressures Japan and other countries to sell more cars and steel and television sets, American companies making the same things are having a tough time of it. So they're asking the government for tariffs, quotas, something to protect them. It's a natural reaction. But many people in Washington are concerned that if we put up trade barriers, other countries will do the same. And that can lead to trade war. To understand how such conflicts get started, let's take a look at the controversy over foreign competition within the fastener industry. Nuts and bolts, that is. These exercises are part of the regular morning routine at Iwata Bolt Company in Kawasaki, Japan. The song they sing reaffirms their dedication to the company and to a brighter future for Japan. For them, and some 65,000 other Japanese workers, that means harder work, increased sales, and an expanding share of the world fastener market. Thanks to their efforts, the value of Japanese nuts and bolts exports to the United States has more than doubled since 1972. John Lorman is chairman of RB&W, one of the country's largest manufacturers of nuts and bolts.
If you had been in this plant 5 years ago, you would have seen practically every piece of machinery operating and a lot more activity in the plant itself. So much of the business of our industry has been lost to imports coming into this country at very low prices, primarily subsidized by the various governments. And accordingly, during this period, our production has dropped almost in half at this plant, and our employment has dropped from almost 800 down to 400 employees.
Recently, the nuts and bolts industry applied to the International Trade Commission for protection from what they considered unfair competition. The ITC voted in favor of their petition, but President Carter said no, and the Congress is now deciding whether or not to override the president. With that petition, the fastener industry joined a growing number of industries that have asked the government for protection from trade competition. Steel, shoes, CB radios, color television. Since April 1975, some 327,000 Americans have received government assistance for jobs lost due to import competition.
There is a great wave in America toward protectionism. I think that the November elections are going to have as a political issue the degree to which the candidate will dedicate himself to preserve American jobs.
We no longer look at the word protectionism as a bad word. We are looking for protection. We're sort of standing back, Simon Pure, and say, well, we're for free trade. We can't be for free trade anymore. We've got to be for fair trade.
You've guaranteed yourself.
Ray Marshall is Secretary of Labor.
Advantages.
More and more people in organized labor and in Congress are talking protectionism. Do you see any danger in protectionism leading to a world depression?
Yes, I can see that we could get ourselves into a situation where we damage all the economies of the world, or most of the economies of the world, through erecting higher and higher tariff barriers.
Hard by the oil price rise in 1973. As you will see, their reaction affected us.
You must be reasonable. How do you expect us to pay those prices?
Those prices were largely responsible for this. People were killed in this street riot touched off by Turkish workers venting their frustrations over the shortage of jobs. Those jobs disappeared when the oil-related recession put a lid on economic activity all over the world. Away in Brazil, a powerful, deeply entrenched military government has acted decisively to stifle such expressions of frustration. The people of Brazil, like us, were enjoying a gradual improvement in the quality of their lives in the early 70s. The economy was growing, life was getting better. Then came the oil price rise.
The primary effect, I think, was one of immediate shock to the economy. Brazil has been traditionally an importer of oil, net importer of oil, importing close to 80% in 1973 of its oil needs, and used to a continued cheap source of energy.
That cheap source of energy, oil, was now 4 times as expensive, and Brazil's economic progress was in serious peril. But the government imposed strict conservation measures that steadily reduced the country's import bill. Fuel prices were allowed to go up to almost $2 a gallon. Automobiles were even developed to run on alcohol made from surplus sugar cane. Gas is not sold on weekends, causing long lines at closing time. Most of these cars are made in Brazil. Similar American models sell here for about $20,000. Brazil has levied taxes of up to 300% for non-essential imports. If Brazil had a popular democracy like ours, you can bet these tough decrees would never have been issued. But Brazil did even more. They adopted a financial strategy that was a colossal gamble. Over the last 4 years, Brazil's leaders have gone abroad to borrow $30 billion, much of it from large commercial banks. Financial centers like London and New York are points where developing countries like Brazil and Turkey connect with big international money. They negotiate high-interest loans. The greater the risk, the higher the interest, and the larger the profit for the bank.
First thing we do is we go out and make loans around the world that meet our credit standards. Then depending on what loans have been made, this creates a demand for funds, and then we go out and bid in the financial markets.
That means that Citibank has to go out and find the money to make the loans.
Cancel that. But it's probably something like our money. Somebody, I don't know.
The people in this room get some of that money from other banks around the world. Ironically, a lot of the money comes from certain OPEC countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
They have more money than they know how to spend, so they deposit it in banks, which then lend it to countries like Brazil and Turkey. This dizzy process is known as recycling. Countries borrow back the money they've spent for oil. Our Congress worries that some weak countries might not be able to repay the bank loans.
How do you answer the charges that massive defaults would put banks like this huge bank into serious trouble?
Right. First of all, that's not cannot happen, and that we follow a policy of diversification. We will never put an excessive amount of funds in any one country, so that even if the worst should happen, the risks that we're taking are of a nature that the bank can always cope with them.
Despite fears in Washington, American banks in Brazil, like this branch of Chase Manhattan, continue to lend. Brazil is now the largest borrower in the developing world. One example, Petrobras, Brazil's government oil monopoly. Oil finds off Brazil's famous beaches have spurred a crash effort to become more energy self-reliant. But Brazil's obsession with cutting down imports goes far beyond new oil production. Driving around Sao Paulo, Brazil's industrial center, you quickly notice a lot of foreign companies, many of them American. To sell in Brazil, you have to produce in Brazil. Even before the oil price rise, this was a policy for cutting imports.
After the price rise, it became more than a valuable policy. This was the stage at which you had to control your imports. And the way that you control your imports is either you simply cut back, or you get companies, both local and foreign, to manufacture the same product locally.
Brazil employs 20,000 people in Brazil, 20,600 to be exact.
These workers are paid about 1/4 what the same workers in the United States receive. And remember, some of these are jobs that once belonged to Americans.
We get incentives from the government to export. The government is concerned about their balance of trade, and we are certainly trying to help.
Ford Brazil is helping and making a lot of money in the process. These Brazilian-made Ford tractors compete around the world with American-made tractors. The highway to the port of Santos carries convoys of heavy trucks packed with goods to be shipped all over the world. Brazil is new at the game, but her exports brought last year's trade figures into perfect balance from a huge deficit after the oil price rise. Shoes, textiles, and other manufactured exports have more than doubled since 1973, and more traditional exports like soybeans, sugar, and of course coffee are growing. Coffee has always been the backbone of Brazil's trade. As with other products in Brazil, the best is skimmed off for export and the remainder left for the Brazilians. Brazil is only one of many developing countries that have stepped up their exports to pay their oil bill. A larger share of the export market for them means a smaller share for us. It's now 5 years since OPEC first quadrupled its prices, and all that time, the American player has continued importing more and more foreign oil. Only now his gluttony is beginning to hurt. That oil has thrown him deeply into debt and made him increasingly dependent on OPEC. The past 5 years haven't been easy on the other players either, but they have faced up to the oil problem, and now everybody is waiting to see if the American will do the same. In 1977, the United States' total import bill was a staggering $26.7 billion more than its exports, a new world record. The whole trade deficit problem is really two issues. Too much expensive oil and other imports coming in, but also not enough exports going out. That's why the Carter administration has been urging other countries, Japan and Germany especially, to help us. Secretary of the Treasury Michael Blumenthal.
The German and the Japanese economies are large and strong. When they grow strongly in their own country, then they increase their demand for foreign goods. As they increase their demand for foreign goods, not only we can sell them more, but also other countries can sell them more. And some of those other countries are our customers, which means that they have money again to buy from us.
The presentation of Mr. Yoshiba fell considerably short.
After a little diplomatic arm twisting, American trade negotiators have now convinced the Japanese to buy more American exports. The Germans, however, have been much more difficult to convince. Trade deficits often occur when one country grows faster and therefore imports more than the countries it trades with. But the problem with our deficit is that we are buying so much more that foreigners and foreign money markets are receiving more dollars than they know what to do with, and that causes the value of the dollar to drop.
Mr. Secretary, the United States has a balance of payments deficit of almost $20 billion. The dollar has dropped dramatically, and we seem to have chronic unemployment and inflation here at home. How does the OPEC price rise fit into this picture?
The more money we have to pay, the more pressure and therefore the more minus numbers we have on our trade balance. And as the trade balance is very much in a minus position, so there is a psychological impact amongst exchange traders, which causes the price of the dollar to weaken.
Are you on the price? One more time, make sure it hasn't come in. Say, many apologies.
That impact was obvious last March 31st at Harris Bank in London. We were there filming when the announcement of a record U.S. trade deficit for February came over the wire.
Total markets are very, very thin. Trade figures just came out, $4.5 billion deficit record. Dollars are just offered. Dollars just offered in the markets.
Yeah. The dollars are offered everywhere. Change that mark, 25, 35.
Yeah, do you have a yen price?
In one day, the value of the dollar dropped dramatically against the Japanese yen.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Scenes similar to this one, with international traders buying and selling currencies, take place all over the world. In London and New York, it's all part of an international confidence game. When news breaks that adversely affects the United States, world confidence is shaken and traders rush to sell dollars.
Bob, I'm selling them. Okay, I'll do 7. The administration conceded that the reason that the dollar was down was lack of energy policy.
Now, when the dollar falls in value, people begin to question the whole stability of the international financial system. And that, I think, is an international problem. It's not just an American problem. It's
Jeffrey Bell is a director of Schroders, an international merchant bank.
And the worrying thing, of course, is that the casualty of the system, as the dollar is weak, could well be slower world growth, the growth of world protectionism, which affects everybody.
Here at home, the sinking dollar does some good things and some bad. On the positive side, it makes American grain and other exports cheaper abroad, so we should sell more and thus reduce our deficit. But that takes time. On the negative side, the cost of imports goes up. That means you're going to have more inflation. It also means that American companies that compete with imports are free to raise their prices. That's exactly what happened recently with the Chevrolet Chevette. The price of Japanese small cars went up, so Chevrolet raised its prices $95. In Saudi Arabia and the rest of the OPEC countries, the declining dollar is costing more, much more. A spokesman for OPEC claims that last year alone, its members lost between $12 and $17 billion because the dollars they received for their oil were worth less. Those oil producers, the Saudis in particular, have reportedly warned President Carter that unless the United States does something about the declining dollar, OPEC will announce another price increase. To find out what effect a major price increase, say a doubling of prices, could have on you, we travel to Data Resources Incorporated in Lexington, Massachusetts.
So we can ask the machines here.
DRI is in the business of making economic projections. Alan Sinai is Vice President of Financial Products.
Now, what would happen if the OPEC ministers got together and announced that the price of oil would be doubled, let's say?
All right. Well, let's see what will happen to the impacts on consumer prices, the prices for goods and services that the average American pays. And very quickly, we see that the rate of inflation is in double-digit figures. It's well over 10%.
That's almost a 60% increase over what we're already used to in inflation. Are you saying that the consumer prices would go up from that level right away?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, what are we about to see on the screen here?
Well, we're now going to see what happens to the price of a gallon of regular gasoline. You see that the new price is $1 a gallon compared with the old price of about 65 cents.
Well, if that would stop everybody from driving so much, it might be a good thing.
Yes, that's
but
right.
Home heating oil,
that's a problem.
It's really going to hurt because people have to heat their houses. If the winters are as bad as this one has been, I guess we're just going to have to learn to live with thermal underwear because that's very nearly a doubling in the price of home heating oil. What would happen to jobs if the OPEC prices doubled?
The number of jobs lost would be 1.75 million.
This is in millions, so that means 1,700,000 people who are now working would lose their job?
That's right, and even worse, under this scenario, they would never get those jobs back.
The pie, in short, will no longer be expanding. It will be rigid or contracting.
John O'Leary is Deputy Secretary of Energy.
And I think that that could lead to very, very serious consequences from the standpoint of the aspirations of the lower 20% of the population.
Could you explain that?
Oh, I think that if you were to say to the ghetto residents in the cities that things are not going to get better, in fact, they're going to get worse, they might take to the streets as they did in the mid-60s.
These grim predictions are all speculation, but they're important because that's what could happen if the United States doesn't reduce its dependence on OPEC oil. One step in that direction is the construction of more energy-efficient buildings. Increased domestic production and the development of alternate energy forms will also help, but not soon enough to avoid the crisis some people are predicting for the mid-1980s. The immediate problem, and the major problem facing Congress today, is how to get you and me to conserve.
We will all agree, that is to say economists, will all agree that the thing that we need is conservation. We'll all agree, too, that if we ask you to conserve, you won't do it for more than 15 minutes. It's human nature to say, well, I don't see a problem. Where's the problem? I'll push my thermostat up to the point where I can afford it. So I think that we're beginning to understand now fully that the road to conservation is price. That you get a man to conserve when it costs him more to drive, costs him more to buy a battery or a tire, costs him more to heat his house or cool his house.
For 12 months now, the Congress has been debating a number of conservation proposals, including incentives for you to insulate your homes and incentives for industry to convert from oil to coal. But the crude oil equalization tax, which would raise the price of domestic oil, has been hopelessly frozen in controversy. Critics charge that none of the programs currently under consideration will have any real impact in forcing conservation.
Some kind of restoration of our independence.
Otto Eckstein is president of Data Resources Incorporated and a former member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors.
The kinds of programs that we are thinking about in this country are not very powerful programs. We really are not responding sufficiently to the challenges in front of our nose.
What should we be doing?
We've really got to do a lot more on conservation, and we've got to do a lot more on supply. We've now gotten pretty clever about the cars. We're really forcing the car manufacturers to produce a European-style car and then making it practically impossible for them to produce anything else in another 5 or 10 years. But we have gotten nowhere on reducing energy use for residential purposes.
As long as Congress and the President don't force conservation, our dependence on foreign oil is going to increase. And that puts your future in the hands of OPEC with no guarantee that they will continue to provide the oil that we need. James Akins is our former ambassador to Saudi Arabia.
How could we ensure that the Saudis will increase production enough to meet our needs?
They've made the conditions quite clear. The first and far and away the most important is that there be peace in the Middle East. They've also said that there must be a conservation effort in the West. That is, they cannot be expected to produce their only resource if oil is being wasted in the West. They've also said that they must be protected against inflation. And finally, and certainly not the least important, is that they must be given or sold the means to defend themselves. And right now, of course, the main issue is the sale of the F-15s.
Saudis, the request for the F-15s is seen as a test of U.S. friendship. To the United States, it's a painful reminder of how our need for oil influences other decisions.